Thank you for joining us this morning for this Housing for All Opportunities for Developers webinar. I'm delighted to be joined today by two of our partners, Bob Jordan, who's the Chief Executive of the Housing Agency, who will be presenting first, and also Paul Kelly, who's Director of Real Estate Finance for AIB, who will be presenting at the end to talk about developer finance. I'm Russell Grange. I'm Director of Property for Circle Voluntary Housing, and I will be presenting in the middle just to highlight the areas around how to work with an AHB. At the end of the session, we'll be doing a Q&A, so both Bob and Paul will be joining me as panelists to respond to any of your questions. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them into the chat box, and then we will address them at the end of the presentations. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Bob to talk about Housing for All. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you so much, Russell, and I'd like to thank John and Circle for the invite today. Next slide, please. It's a little bit of a safari of topics in relation to, I suppose, everything to do with housing for all, and particularly focusing in on social housing and cost rental. Hopefully I'll get through it all, but I thought it was very important to take the opportunity today, given so many people are taking part, to try and cover as much as possible. Next. The Housing Agency, I'm the CEO of the Housing Agency. Basically, the Housing Agency is a support body. It's a government body that supports the Department of Housing, the local authorities, approved housing bodies, and works very closely with other agencies in the sector to really make the housing system work better for everyone. Next, we are very much involved at three levels, I think, in the housing system. So, for instance, tomorrow, 3 ministers will launch the National Housing Strategy for Disabled People. We've been very involved in the consultation process and drafting that. We were also very involved in 2021 in the Affordable Housing Act and bringing forward cost rental. At the programme level, we're the national coordinator for the Mortgage to Rent scheme. We're involved in acquiring properties for local authorities and approved housing bodies. And we're involved across a whole range of programme areas to do with homelessness, older people, and so on. But we also are a hands-on organisation. We do provide direct support, technical support to both approved housing bodies and local authorities around areas like feasibility studies, funding, design, contract management and project management in relation to housing delivery. And we've worked with over 50 AHBs in the last 5 years, and indeed on a daily basis we're working with every local authority in the country. Next. Just very briefly, because I'm at the beginning of this, I suppose approved housing bodies are major, a major force in terms of delivering social housing in Ireland. They're non-profit bodies. There's about 450 AHBs actually registered with the Department of Housing. We've been running with the Voluntary Regulation Office for AHBs for the last couple of years. There's about 286 there that I suppose have been involved in the regulation process. But the reality is that there's a small number of AHBs that are pulling a long train in terms of the sector. The larger AHBs in general are involved in providing general needs family housing. And then there's probably a higher proportion that are involved in providing specialist housing for people who experience homelessness, older people, people with disabilities, and so on. And just recently, they've moved into an area called cost rental, which I'll talk about later on. Next. In terms of delivery, in 2020, 42% of overall social housing was delivered by AHBs. The sector owns 43,000 properties versus about 150,000 owned by local authorities. The sector is growing. It's a growing sector, about 10% a year, but some of the larger bodies are growing by 20%. Predominantly, it's turnkey and construction turnkeys, but also acquisitions and leasing. And I suppose, you know, in terms of the pipeline going forward, assembling land and identifying site requirements is a major issue. Next. Just very briefly to talk about the Housing Agency's activities with AHBs, we actually are involved in the funding process in terms of assessing funding applications for the P&A and CAF, which maybe Russell will talk about a little bit later on. We're involved in acquiring properties directly for AHBs. We're involved in project management and procurement supports. And I suppose one of the things to say is that that kind of support unit within the housing agency is mentioned in Housing for All as being an area to be expanded in terms of the technical team. So I suppose it's a reassuring for people here to know that AHBs are obviously very competent in the work that they do, but also there is support available from the housing agency in terms of construction projects and turnkey projects. We're also involved in land development. I'll mention cost rental later on. And we, as I said earlier, we're the national coordinator for the mortgage to rent scheme, which is about keeping people who've been affected by mortgage arrears in their homes as social housing tenants. Next. This is just a summary of all the areas that we cover through our projects procurement and program unit and all the supports that we provide to AHBs. Next. Housing for All, government policy launched in September. I want to very briefly go through the highlights of this before I go on to talk about social housing and cost rental housing. 4 pathways in Housing for All. I suppose the most important thing about Housing for All is the multi-annual funding that's available, 4 billion per year. And I suppose the level of ambition in Housing for All in terms of housing targets. Next, please. So 4 billion per year to 2030, 300,000 homes to be delivered at the end of 2030, including 90,000 social homes, which is obviously directly relevant to AHBs, as is the 18,000 cost rental homes, affordable purchase, and 170,000 private homes. And I'll just go through the pathways in Housing for All. Obviously, it's a long document with 213 actions, so I can only really touch on the headlines under each of these pathways. Next. Pathway 1, I think the main idea, and in fact, you could say the main kind of idea in Housing for All is about embedding an affordable housing segment within the overall housing system that bridges the gap between private housing and social housing for people on moderate incomes. The housing agency is very involved in, I suppose, bringing to fruition 2 of the affordable purchase scheme, the first home shared equity schemes, which I'm sure you've read about, which is for first-time buyers nationwide, and then the local authority affordable purchase scheme, which is really designed to target areas, about 14 local authorities where there are affordability constraints, and obviously there's an equity stake involved, which will be, taken out by the local authorities or indeed by private lenders. Cost rental, as I said, I keep promising to come to it, and I will come to it. I suppose the other thing here is the changes in Part 5, moving from 10% social only to 20% social and affordable, protecting tenants in the private rented sector by extending the rent pressure zones to end 2024, and obviously giving people tenancies of indefinite duration, and some changes to the local authority home loan, particularly in relation to single people. Next. Pathway 2 is the one that's really directly relevant to social homes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. It's also to do with certainly the response to homelessness. So one of the big responses to homelessness, particularly for people who are rough sleeping, people who are long-term in homelessness, is the Housing First programme. It involves moving people into permanent homes and providing them with wraparound supports. The number of tenancies to be delivered by 2026 there is 1,300. The issue, I suppose, in terms of development is for people who are homeless, the vast majority of people who are homeless, single homeless, need 1-bed properties. 1-bed properties are very thin on the ground in terms of, maybe 5 to 10% of the social housing programme currently provides 1 beds. So there's an opportunity, a development opportunity there to provide 1 beds to meet the needs of people who are homeless and to clearly bring down those homeless figures. There's also a promise for a youth homelessness strategy and so on. Next. Increasing new housing supply. So one of the, and the housing agency is involved in this as well. You may have read about the Croí Cónaithe Cities Fund. So we know that there are 70 to 80,000 unactivated planning permissions around the country, about 40,000 in Dublin, particularly for the apartment developments of 4 stories or more. The idea of the Croí Cónaithe Cities Fund is to step in with an intervention that allows those planning permissions to be activated by developers, with up to the 20% of the cost of each individual unit being covered. Now, we're still involved in designing that program at the moment, but it will be launched towards the end of the month. So this is the idea that people have a desire to live in urban areas, a desire to live in apartments in those areas, And I suppose it feeds into the goals of the National Planning Framework, which are really about compact urban growth and the idea that basically new build should be at least half of it in the footprint of our existing cities and so on. And obviously that feeds into the further environmental agenda and so on. Land availability is a big issue, and obviously the Land Development Agency has a big role to play in terms of land assembly, particularly of state sites. Land value sharing is really about planning gain and how that's, I suppose, shared out with local authorities in order to develop local infrastructure and housing going forward. And you'll have read about the tax to activate vacant residential lands. Next. In terms of addressing vacancy, the town centre first, anybody who's watched EcoEye, I think last week, will have seen the town centre first strategy covered. The goals of that are really to reactivate and reanimate our towns and cities where there are vacant residential and commercial properties, bringing them back into use. Some of the AHBs, like for instance, the Peter McVerry Trust, have been very involved in the repair and leasing and buy and renew scheme, bringing residential properties back into use. But there's going to be a much more of a government focus on that. And also in terms of the Croí Cónaí Towns as opposed to Cities Fund, providing service sites for people to build their own properties there. Next. So in terms of social housing and AHBs, just a small number of slides here. Next. So as I said, Housing for All has a goal for 90,000 new build social homes to be delivered over the period to 2030, nearly 50,000 new builds. The AHBs are being tasked with delivering over 20,000. Long-term leasing, which you'll be very familiar with, is being phased out. So the focus on Housing for All, and this is really important, is on new build and construction. And there will be significantly lower acquisitions under the programme as well. Next. So these are the percentages. So I think what this tells us actually is that the approved housing body sector is going head to head with local authorities in terms of delivering social housing, particularly in the predominantly, the urban areas. You see the Cork local authorities, Dublin local authorities there, but equally outside the main urban centres, 40%. So there's a ramping up of the sector, which has been growing over the last couple of years, and that momentum needs to be maintained. Next. So before Christmas, each local authority in the country was required to produce a housing delivery action plan that really mapped out their social housing delivery pipeline to 2026. But I think what's most important about that is that AHBs are now very much part of that process as well. So there are figures in there for AHBs in terms of providing general needs housing, specialist housing for the groups I mentioned earlier, and cost rental. And obviously, AHBs are seen as having a key role in terms of supporting social housing objectives around the issues I mentioned around tackling vacancy, around disability, and that strategy, as I mentioned, is going to be delivered tomorrow. Unfortunately, on both the disability front and in terms of older people, really, I think the delivery has probably fallen behind in the last couple of years, and there's a real push to now catch up. Actually, in the area of homelessness, there's probably being more delivered, but as I said to you, there is a pinch point in terms of the one-bed properties. Next. Cost rental. Cost rental is a new housing tenure in Ireland. What's different about cost rental? What's different about cost rental is basically that rents are really linked to the cost of producing the housing, managing and maintaining it, rather than the market rent. And the idea is that cost rents should be at least 25% below market. It's a success story across Europe, and actually the Housing Agency published an international study there with Housing Europe recently, which is very interesting to look at, but to look at how this model really dominates in other countries, the rental market, and obviously dampens the overall level of rent that people have to pay. Next. So what are the benefits? Stable rents that are more affordable, secure tenancies through professional long-term management, a sustainable funding model, and a scaling up. So the idea is that 18,000 cost rental homes will be delivered over the period of Housing for All. But the ambition here is really to get this model to scale in such a way that it dampens overall market rents. And that's what it's done across Europe. Next. I can't get into all the detail here, but what you can see is basically the income, the tenant rent needs to cover the loan repayments and the operational costs, which is obviously less than market rent. And there's a lot of science behind this. We're still developing, I suppose, an Irish version of an international model. Some of you might have attended the Vienna Model Exhibition in 2019 that was organised by ourselves and Dublin City Council, which was looking at how this model has made rents affordable in Austria. Next. The Housing for All targets, as I mentioned, 18,000. Clearly, that's a small number, but it's the beginning of a journey where we map out a much bigger cost rental sector. Next. The delivery models in Ireland, local authority direct delivery, local authority delivery through partnerships with the Land Development Agency, but also very importantly, AHBs have been playing a very key role, and the first cost rental developments came forward in just this year, last year in 2021, and there are more coming forward now in 2022. So 35 million for 390 homes and 70 million set aside for 2022. Next. I can't get into this because I'm probably running out of time, but just to say that the housing agency is the provider of cost rental equity loans, and the housing finance agency is also involved in providing this. So listen, I suppose the most important thing in getting rents down is you have low cost land, low cost loans available through the housing finance agency and through the housing agency. And as you go forward, you seek to keep management and maintenance costs at a lower level in order to keep rents affordable. Next. Cost rental equity loan, it's just giving you the details there. We provide a loan of up to 30% over a 40-year term with no repayments due during the term. So obviously that allows the scheme to be managed and keep rents low. Next. These are just some details around the schemes. You will have read about them in the newspapers. Next. And there are future schemes, as I'm sure you've mentioned, in larger developments such as Oscar Traynor Road, Shangenna, and so on. Next. Next. Okay, sorry, this is the final slide, so I've got there. So just to say, in terms of Housing for All is a unique opportunity in terms of the multi-annual promise of funding. There is strong demand for both social and affordable housing, and bringing forward this new cost rental model. One of the things I think in our kind of consultations with approved housing bodies is, I think one of the things that will be an impediment to development pipelines, or is currently an impediment, is the availability of land and service sites. And that's something we're going to have to consider going forward. Obviously, the Land Development Agency has a role to play there, local authorities, but there will be a need to acquire land as we go forward. Just to say that the Housing Agency has been operating a voluntary regulation office for the approved housing body for 7 years. Just this year, we stopped at the end of December, and there is a statutory regulator, the AHB Regulatory Authority, that has now commenced in 2022. I think what's important about that is in terms of giving confidence to private finance providers that they are working with a regulated sector. It's a very well operated sector, but I think that kind of gives the independence, the independent oversight that's required to give maybe more confidence in terms of going out and getting private finance. We need to continue to build on the successful delivery models that are there, both in terms of the general needs family housing, but also the specialist housing. I think one of the things for the development sector that's quite interesting is that because approved housing bodies may no longer just be involved in the provision of social housing, but also in the provision of cost rental housing, it clearly allows an opportunity to develop larger developments, mixed tenure developments. And I think it provides opportunities for AHBs as well, not just to be involved in the construction of housing, acquisition of housing, and management of housing, but also to be involved in a vision for places and in placemaking. And that's, I think, a very exciting opportunity that's provided through Housing for All. What I'd like to say is there are opportunities out there for small to medium-sized developers to work at scale with the approved housing body sector. But increasingly, I've seen a number of small but key brownfield sites being developed by AHBs across the country, and we also need to maintain the momentum on that as well. So that's all I have to say this morning. Thank you so much for listening.